Welcome everyone to our roundtable. How can WTO rules better prevent and mitigate food crisis? As you know, world hunger has been increasing even before the pandemic, and conflict has compounded this food crisis even further by hampering trade in food and agricultural inputs. In this context, and considering that the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO is taking place while I am speaking, the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development have put together this roundtable. The idea of this session today would be to discuss the role of the WTO, and by WTO I mean WTO members, in the prevention and mitigation of food crisis. We have 4 outstanding speakers, all of them with a recognized expertise on agricultural trade. I am also pleased to see the Agriculture Division of the WTO moderating this roundtable. Thank you, Jonathan, for being here today with us. So without any further ado, I pass the floor to Jonathan, who will share with us some introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Facundo, and thanks to the co-sponsors, IOSD, IFPRI, and IATP for the invitation to facilitate this discussion. It's absolutely fantastic to be back with former colleagues and friends. Some of you may know I was previously at IOSD myself and worked with some of the people who are on the panel today. So it's really lovely to be back amongst people who I know have lots and lots to say on this topic, which is a really timely one. How can WTO rules better prevent and mitigate food crises? So I'm really interested in what people have to say. As Facundo just said, we've got a great panel with lots of people who've looked into these questions in some depth. And it's a topic which is right now on the agenda of ministers and WTO members for MC12. Yes, food prices are at a record high. As Facundo just said, the number of hungry people is high and rising. Why is that? Well, there's a whole host of different factors behind this. We know that there are conflicts going on in the world. There's Ukraine, but conflicts also elsewhere. There's the COVID pandemic and the slow and unequal recovery from that. Climate change, climate shocks, economic downturns, supply chain issues. There's a whole load of different things which are having consequences on global markets for food and agriculture. And yes, it's a food crisis, there's a looming food crisis, but if you look at the number of hungry people, if you scroll back a few years, it is worse now than it was in 2014, when there were 606 million hungry people. Arguably, that was already a food crisis. That was already 606 million hungry people, too many. But we're in a situation which is seemingly getting worse and worse today. So in that context, what's the role for the WTO? What's the role for WTO rules and the implementation of those rules? I'd love to hear from our panelists today how WTO rules can improve all the different aspects on food security, food access, food availability, food stability, food utilization. For example, how can they help tackle poverty and unemployment in rural and urban areas? What can they do to help improve farm productivity sustainably? This is a major question for many developing countries in particular. How can they strengthen resilience to future shocks, especially for the most vulnerable people? How can they improve diversity in food and nutrition, in people's diets? And so without any more ado, let's get to the discussion. We have a great panel today. So I'd like to introduce them one by one as we get to them. The first person is Valeria Pinheiro of IFPRI, who will be speaking to us about transparency and export restrictions. Valeria, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you very much for putting together this amazing panel with all the other panelists here. So I will just concentrate in this presentation on just 2 topics that can affect food security through their impact on trade and markets, and that are particularly concerned amid the current crisis, of course, the food crisis. So these are the export restrictions and public stock holding programs. This work has been done at IFPRI with my colleagues Joseph Glover, David Laborde, Abdallah Mamoun, and Elsa Olivetti. And more specifically, it is based on a blog that we just published yesterday, which is titled MC12, How to Make the WTO Relevant in the Middle of a Food Crisis. Next slide, please. So I would like just to start by highlighting the fact that export restrictions contribute to sudden changes in international prices that can be exacerbated by creating volatility and inducing greater market uncertainty, which of course that affect production decisions for the future campaigns. So this slide on the left show in red the days of excessive volatility for many commodities, seeing a lot of red dots starting in 2022, as you can see. And then the figure on the right relates to export restrictions. So the top figure represents the percentage of global trade calories under restriction, and the one on the bottom is the number of countries implemented food export restrictions. It could be bans or licensing as well. So if we looked at the last 3 crises, we can see that in 2008, with the food crisis, 8 countries had implemented export restrictions covering approximately 7% of trade. By the end of March, some 15 countries representing 16% of trade had implemented restrictions. These restrictions remain in place throughout most of 2008, with the number of countries implementing them rising to 35 during that summer, and a number of commodities were affected, principally wheat and rice in that case, that cover 17% of total calories traded in the world. Then during the first 4 weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, 21 countries implemented export restrictions on actually a wide range of products. And the peak was in May of June 2020, with about 8% of total calories traded were affected. By late summer, most of those countries have really relaxed actually those export restrictions. And now since the Russian invasion, what we can see is since February 24th, the number of countries imposing these export restrictions on just food has climbed from 3 to 23. And the total amount of exports affected by these restrictions represents more or less 16% of the calories traded in the world. Next slide. So what is the effect on food importers and exporters? I just want to highlight with this slide the differences that can be affected between if you're a net food importer or exporter or the least developed countries. So we looked at the last 3 crises again, that is in this figure, we can see that the poorest countries suffer the most from these policies, and more if they are net food importers, since export restrictions to target commodities and staple food products like wheat, soy, rice, etc. And the impacts are larger for less developed countries, that is the bar on the top. So if we look at the 3 crises, we can see that between 25 and 30% it is in the case of less developed countries, but instead only 15% for developed economies. So we can see that the pattern for the 3 crises is basically the same in terms of which country is affected the most, even though the cause of the crisis, it is different. So we can really see that the impact of the policy was the same, even though the cost was different. Next slide, please. So this slide covers about notifications in particular. So export restrictions, we can see that notifications rates are very low, and most of them are late. We at IFPRI, we've been tracking this with the export restriction tracker that is available online. And we can learn that out of 28 countries, 22 are member countries of the WTO. A total of 66 individual measures or export restrictions came into effect. And of these, only 15 were notified to the WTO. Of these 15, 12 measures were notified after the start date of export restrictions came into effect. And then the last one is the average number of days passed between the start date of the restriction and the notification date is 70. So with this, what we can learn is that just a few countries provide notifications before it comes into effect. And there is no obvious link between the country size or level of income and the notification process. This shows that it is not a lack of capacity, but a lack of political will that remains the main problem. And we have to remember that this policy is not just a beggar the neighbor policy, but it actually hurts also the farm sector in the long term and reduces supply in the exporter country. So it affects both sides of the story. Next slide, please. And then we looked at public stockholding programs are used by some governments to purchase a stockpile and distribute food to the most vulnerable parts of their population. But there are two issues that are a source of discussion among members of the WTO. The first one is that some stockholding programs are considered to be trade disrupting when they involve purchases from farmers at prices fixed or supported, not supported or administered prices. And then the second one is that current public stocks are highly concentrated just about some few countries. This makes finding a balance between the flexibility required by least and middle income countries that have limited fiscal capacity to distort global markets. So these are most the African economies, and the risk of strong disruptions that could occur when such flexibilities are granted and used actually by the large emerging countries. So it becomes very complex, finding this balance. So this figure, what it shows is the grain stocks by some countries, just Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and China, to illustrate these issues. And then I would like to end with two things to add. That huge stockpiling by public authorities create a lot of uncertainty. We can see the case of China, for example. And then the transparency also applies when we talked about this topic. Next slide, please. So with crisis, some governments may feel the pressure to prioritize an agenda of self-sufficiency in energy and food, easing climate mitigation and environmental protection measures to allow for production increases, creating distortions and inefficiencies. So what countries can do? The best approach, of course, will be just to just allow markets to work by removing distortions and support the most vulnerable countries and households via social safety nets where it is more needed, also through humanitarian assistance through the WFP. And net food exporters should refrain from the temptations to apply export restrictions and implement sanctions that obstruct food and fertilizer trade. And then the net food importers should not apply import subsidies, promote self-sufficiency in food, and of course, the panic buying. But then what can the WTO do to promote this long-term food security? It could clarify and strengthen WTO rules on market distorting trade restrictions to reduce pressure on global prices. And then it can also strengthen overall transparency. Again, the same thing that we've been talking here, to reduce uncertainty and discourage protectionism. More specifically on export restrictions, there are two things that we also mentioned in the blog. The first one is a decision not to impose export prohibitions or restrictions on foodstuffs purchased for non-commercial humanitarian purposes, the WFP, and then some improvements in the cross-cutting issue of transparency. And then with respect of public stockholding programs, also there are two things that I would like to say. The first one is that stocks acquired under the PSH program should not distort or adversely affect the food security of other WTO members. And then the second one is that no direct or indirect exports from these stocks should be occur. And then just to conclude, there are some food geopolitics have emerged as a main component of global geopolitics. Alliances with think-alike countries are becoming more tangible, creating even a bigger need for a multilateral trade system that works and that it is based on the 5 principles of the WTO, which is trade without discrimination, freer trade through negotiation, predictability through binding and transparency, promoting fair competition and encouraging development and economic reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valeria. That was absolutely fantastic. Plenty of food for thought there. And I know IFPRI's been doing a huge amount of work on this topic. Let's move directly to Annelies Dues from OECD, who will be speaking also on the same topic of transparency and export restrictions. Annelies, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. So first of all, I would like to thank Facundo and Jonathan for organizing this round table on a very important topic. So my name is Annelies Dues. I work at the OECD, where I lead the work on agricultural trade. So during my short presentation, I'll also cover the topics of transparency and export restrictions in responding to food crisis. And I've organized my presentation around the questions that are listed in the agenda. Next slide, please. So starting with the first question, namely, how can transparency increase the predictability of agricultural trade? Well, there are two key ways in which transparency can increase the predictability of agricultural trade. So first of all, transparency reduces market uncertainty. So by publishing information, there is less market uncertainty, which increases confidence in markets and trade. And this then in turn lowers the risks of people and governments taking damaging decisions based on incomplete information. Now, which type of information is needed? Well, we need information on market conditions, supply, demand, price, trade, and stock volumes. But this is not enough. We also need information on domestic and trade policies to form a complete picture of the current situation and to anticipate how markets might evolve in the short and in the medium term. Also, we not only need information at the national level, but also at the global level, because there could be a bad harvest in one country, and these losses could be completely offset by good harvest prospects in another country. Then the second way in which transparency increases the predictability of agricultural trade is because transparency exposes bottlenecks and highlights risks. That is, by having access to accurate and timely information, policymakers can triage problems, and then they can ensure that efforts and policies are directed at priority areas. So the second point really illustrates the other requirements for transparency. Namely, first of all, there needs to be rapid access to accurate and timely information. Second, consistent reporting over time is crucial, and that's because that's the only way to establish whether the current situation is deviating from pre-existing trends and how the emergent situation compares to previous crises. And these types of insights can only be obtained if market indicators and policy decisions have been consistently monitored and reported over time. And finally, to obtain a full picture of the situation, it's also necessary to be able to compare information across commodities and across countries. Now, a final point I would like to make about transparency is that transparency is not automatic. It takes time and resources to set up well-established structures for certain types of information gathering. And it takes time and resources to continue gathering this type of information. Because when a crisis situation occurs, it's very difficult to set up these systems. And so we need to have these systems already in place. Next slide, please. Turning then to the second question, which focuses also on export restrictions, namely which transparency tools can help WTO members deal with the effects of export restrictions. So here I would like to make a distinction between two types of information depending on how the information is used. Namely, is it used for short-term informative purposes, or is it used for more longer-term purposes to evaluate trends and examine impacts? Now, for the first type, namely the short-term analysis, there is a need for timely information and reporting on export restrictions, namely who introduced which type of export restriction, for how long, under which conditions, on which commodity. And there exist several initiatives already that provide this type of information. The first one is the AMOS Market Monitor. This is a monthly publication that provides market and policy information about the 4 key staple crops, namely maize, rice, wheat, and soybeans. And one of the sections in the report describes recent policy developments. And this section also includes, of course, export restrictions. A second tool is the IFPRI export restrictions tracker, and this tool was already mentioned also by Valeria in the previous presentation. And there's also the global trade alert, and this tool covers also many policies, including export restrictions. However, if you're interested in more long-term analysis, then the AMOS policy database could be useful. This database, which will be launched later this month, contains domestic and trade policy information for the 4 AMOS crops in the 28 AMOS countries. And here in this slide, you see a screenshot of this online tool. So there is an option to query and download the entire database. And there's also a section called Policies at a Glance. And there you have interactive graphs where you can explore the database. And several of these graphs are about export restrictions. And I've just copied a screenshot of one of those graphs, which shows the evolution of export bans in AMOS countries on the 4 AMOS commodities. And so this graph really illustrates the point I was making before, namely, because we have been consistently tracking and reporting policy information over time, we can see how it compares to previous crisis situations. And in this graph, for example, you can immediately see that there was this revival of export bans at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, but compared to 2007, 2008, these bans were much more short-lived. So that's it for me for now. So in the interest of time, I will end my presentation here and looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Annelies, and thank you also for trying your best to keep to time. We're really struggling with a huge topic here and very little time available to address all of these complex interrelated questions. I was very pleased that you mentioned AMOS and talked about that, because I know that's an area where OECD and also WTO, my colleagues, have been actively contributing, and it's such a valuable mechanism from a transparency point of view. So without any further ado, let's go straight to our next speaker. Sophia Murphy from IATP will talk about gaps in current rules. Sophia, I know you've written your entire PhD on this topic or related topics, so it's going to be a challenge to keep within the time limit, but please do share with us some of the main messages that you'd like to share at this particular juncture. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and thanks IATP. The Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy is very happy to be a co-sponsor of the conversation and to be here. And you know, no one can talk short before they've talked long. So maybe the PhD is out of the way, and it'll help me to stick to time. I just want to pick up on a few different things. The gaps really, for me, in the architecture, not just gaps in rules that we could add and maybe supplement, but in some fundamental ways in which the Agreement on Agriculture, I think, needs to be reoriented. And the timeliness of this food security conversation to perhaps allow more open thought about this than at some times previous, although in 2008 that wasn't what happened. Maybe this time it can be. So first, I think that it's really important to remember that the Agreement on Agriculture was designed to be revised. The governments were failed to meet the extent of their ambition. They actually dealt at the end, and not very well, with a lot of food import developing country concerns that came late to the discussion. And the agreement said, we're coming back, we're going to revise the rules, we're going to keep moving. Of course, it really hasn't. And I think that that has become a crisis of its own in terms of what the agreement can be doing and how responsive it is to the situation that countries are facing now. And I think that that's worthy of thought in relation to the appellate body and that whole crisis in the institution outside of agriculture, on to what extent the WTO is a rules enforcing mechanism with sanctions, and to what extent it's a forum in which trust can be built and markets encouraged by building confidence that the rules respond to countries. I feel at the moment that the rigid enforcement of rules that are not responding and haven't evolved as was intended by those who drafted them is building in, it doesn't inspire the confidence we need to hope that there's going to be, for any big announcement out of MC12 as an example. And I think that that's very particular to food security. One of the really important things missing in the beginning architecture was the assumption that food security was primarily domestic and that the international market was primarily about commerce. And actually at the time, and still more now, food security is deeply enmeshed in international systems, especially for small economies. Whether they're rich or poor, they trade to get their food. and the failure to recognize the political importance of that food trade as distinct from a trade in car parts or tourist services, I think has undermined the politics or the feasibility of what's expected from the politics of food security. I think another important thing, and I touched on it perhaps at the end, I was asked questions about competition, the assumption that the state was the source of distortions and that markets themselves weren't distorting has also undermined the ability of the rules to really handle the food security crisis as we might hope. And I think the elimination of state trading exporters, for example, actually has reduced competition in international markets in important ways. It's definitely reduced transparency of the kind that Annalise was talking about. And that, at the same time as we've deregulated commodity futures markets, has made international pricing less stable and less predictable. And that's done at a time where you have buyers, countries like Egypt, locked into contracts in order to provide food for their consumers. So the idea that we had to deal with production subsidy and not consumption subsidy has really just kicked a problem down the road, where now you've got buyers locked in and sellers taking advantage of that situation whenever a chance to raise prices comes forward. So I think that if we look ahead and trying to keep an eye on this time, first, I think, well, not first, I've been saying first all the way through. One important assumption in the agreement is that we need exceptions for food security. And I've already said exceptions, because food security is domestic, doesn't cut it. Food security is also in internationally traded food. And the World Food Programme, it's another example of that. Of course, these foods should be exempt, but it's a pretense to think that that tiny amount of food that goes through the World Food Programme is the only food secure import that matters for countries trying to protect their consumers from very high price spikes. There's a lot of other food moving in those markets that are affected by the export bans and that affect food security as a result. But also there's a lot of food that's just not in the market. It's mediated in some way. There's school lunch programs, there's ration cards, there's self-provisioning, still hugely important for a very large number of food insecure people. And so the idea that this food security thing is a remnant is a mistake, I think. And when we look at our food statistics, we have to remember that we're not counting a lot of the food that is important for food security. And so we mustn't allow the information and databases that we have to distort our understanding of where else food is and how else that food moves. And how can we, I would disagree, Valeria, really, I think not ultimately in the principle, but without stronger local markets, without stronger regional markets, the international market isn't able to do its job. There's something about diversifying where our food comes from, diversifying the number of traders and producers that there are, but also in diversifying the scales of markets that are able to work effectively. And I do think that the Agreement on Agriculture made some headway in some important aspects of international trade, but by not allowing a stronger, allowing productivity to increase where it's needed, more public investment in a lot of countries is needed. Those stronger food systems would, I think, stabilize international markets, would reduce the propensity for things like export bans, and would also ease the political tension at the World Trade Organization to allow that organization to get on with its piece. It's only a small but really important piece of a larger food security challenge that governments face. I'll leave it there for now, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Actually, you've reminded me of something that I was even thinking of saying earlier on, which is, I guess, important that when you're talking about architecture and so on. So Facundo, I think, has wanted you, the panelists, to focus very much on the Agreement on Agriculture, but clearly trade affects food security from farm to fork. We need to be thinking also about the relationship of trade and food security beyond simply the Agreement on Agriculture, because they are related, including in areas where some of the organizations that are co-sponsoring this panel are very active, whether it's fisheries subsidies or fossil fuel subsidies or whatever. There are other implications for markets and for food security, even though that probably takes us some way beyond the scope of what Facundo wants us to look at today, and you, the co-sponsors. Okay, so thank you very much. Let's move to our fourth speaker, Ranja Sengupta from Third World Network, who will also talk to us about gaps in the current rules and her thoughts on that question. Ranja, please, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan, and thanks also to IISD, IFPRI and IATP for organizing this very timely webinar. I mean, I think no time like now, right, with the ministerial and also the multiple food crises that they're building on each other, the pandemic followed by this, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And but we've had similar situations before, and we will have more. So it is the opportune time to really get into this discussion. And what I was saying is that, you know, later, even when we will have environment-related crises, health crisis like the pandemic, and I think all crises will have a food security phase, because that's the product which really gets most impacted. And I think we do need to look at it long term. Quickly, let me just say that, you know, I'm speaking very much from a developing country perspective. I come from a developing country. And I think this problem we have to recognize is that it is more acute in developing countries, in net food importing developing countries, and of course LDCs. One is big issue is of course their financial constraint, the adverse terms of trade, but their inability to also produce what they need, sometimes due to lack of policy space. And that's where I'll come back to the agreement on agriculture. But so what we have from any developing country perspective, two sources for any country for that matter, two sources of food supplies. One is, of course, you produce domestically, meet your own food needs. And second, you depend on trade, right? Now, trade, of course, remains critical, but domestic production, I think, remains like as important, if not more important, source of supply. And what Sophia was saying, that, you know, local markets, local production, and even regional markets are a very important source of supplies for many of our countries. We know that this trade, the global trade, the trading system and the architecture is far from perfect. There is a lot of concentration. One, we know that there's, you know, just a few business companies which dominate global trade. But also when you look at the data, there's high concentration in terms of countries. You know, just a few countries are exporting major. I mean, if you look at each food product, it's just a few countries who are actually exporting. So, you know, top 5 countries, for example, contribute 63.8% of global wheat exports. Maize, 4 countries account for 72%. Soya oil, only 3 countries are contributing nearly 60% of exports, and so on. It's kind of similar. So therefore, given this, you know, concentration and also volatility in global agricultural markets, I know many developing countries and LDCs find it difficult to, you know, adhere to this this prescription that trade will solve all their problems. I mean, they cannot depend, you know, for meeting the food security needs of sometimes very large populations from a very volatile and concentrated global market. So you see there's one political crisis, and I mean, the whole world is facing a food crisis, right? So, and this concentration is, of course, not just due to trade rules, not even due to trade, all of it. Of course, countries have their, you know, own natural resource endowments, climatic conditions, and many other factors, but trade does play a significant role. And that's why I think we are looking to the WTO and to trade policy to solving this long-term problem. Now, so basically, in the short term, of course, and some of the discussions we had, for example, export restrictions are very short-term measures. But I think there can be, you know, other short-term solutions that you think about. For example, if countries, even during a political conflict or whatever, you should keep supply channels open. You know, shipping routes should not be blocked for food exports, especially say to NFIDCs, LDCs. Payment channels should not be blocked. So there are many short-term measures one could look at. But I think what we have been really hearing also from developing country delegates and, you know, speaking to policymakers across many of these countries is that they are looking beyond short-term, I call them band-aid solutions, to really addressing the deep structural issues. And I would then here, I will make Facundo very happy, because I will go to the agreement on agriculture, because we know that it has very inequitable rules. And as Sophia said, I mean, it was made, you know, some of these rules were made to be, you know, looked at and should have been stock taking to see whether these are working. So on the one hand, I see that, you know, for example, there are unfair rules. For example, only 32 members enjoy extra AMS entitlements, and 96% of that entitlement goes to developed countries, right? Then there's, we know, trade distorting use of the green box. So this actually distorts markets against farmers and farmers in developing countries, LDCs and NFIDCs. And on the other hand, what we also see that these rules constrain the policy space, because as I said, this augmenting production, and that's also because, it is certain food, it's suited to our food needs. It is the most nutritious because it's suited to our agroclimatic conditions, poor cereals and all that. But we've seen trade rules actually penetrate, markets, local markets, and destroy any possibility of developing these products, and meeting food security needs. So, so I think this is, but we've seen even during this MC12 discussion, whenever developing countries tried to raise this issue of giving them the policy space to augment production. And this is very much resisted. What is said is, no, just depend on global markets. But I think, if these countries really augmented their production, which is, as I said, suited to local needs, but also it will actually help stabilize global markets. It's not inimical. It's not against the interest of having a fair, just, and a more transparent global system of trade. So what we see now, I think, in terms of the Food Security Declaration, WFP, they don't really give, any new tools. WFP's, whole procurement and the volumes, it is very small. It's not really going to solve long-term food security needs. And I think that really needs, therefore, look at what the AOA rules are doing and what it can do better. The WTO cannot solve all problems of food security, I think, for the world, but the ones it can would need engagement with this, this whole, the system that it is kind of putting in place. So I would say that, one important thing would be actually to conclude the outstanding, many of these negotiations, public stockholding, SSM, cotton, and also domestic support negotiations with special and differential treatment in domestic support. Because I think though they have, there are criticisms against, but for example, the way export restrictions may be, adding to the uncertainty, making global trade unpredictable, even special safeguard import surges do that. And SSM would have been the solution for that. And public stockholding, it may not be a perfect instrument, but our countries depend on it. During COVID, during this food crisis, I think many countries would be in deep trouble if they didn't have an effective public stockholding program. So, I think a lot of these issues, we need serious engagement of the WTO membership together to be able to look at these, because I think these short-term fixes simply will not work. And I'm just going to end with a process issue, which is been of major concern to, I know, many developing countries, but also civil society organizations, which is this whole process of decision-making in the WTO. And that does not work well for finding really constructive solutions for the entire membership. One is the green room process. Earlier we used to hear, these green room negotiations happen only, say, during a ministerial last few days, but now critical negotiations. Frankly, all three tracks that we see going into MC12 have been negotiated majorly in green rooms, where a few countries are deciding kind of on solutions or taking decisions which would have major impact on the entire membership. So this is undemocratic, it's non-transparent, and so what about, I think if we're talking about transparency, then these process issues need to be kind of also taken account of. And civil society organizations, we were actually not allowed to enter the WTO building the first day. Because, and this you do not see in any UN agency. There is a system and a process of CSO engagement. They have a space because it actually helps the process of decision making by, actually bringing in accountability, transparency, and I think democratic kind of participation. And I think that's as important to finding these solutions. And if the WTO actually has to find viable solutions, it has to allow countries and organizations, civil society to participate in these processes. And thanks a lot. I'll end it here.
Thanks, Ranja. You've raised a whole load of different questions, and I'm very conscious that we don't have very much time left. So I did want to come back to some of the other speakers and give them a chance to respond to some of the things that you've said. I'm sure people have got lots of thoughts there. I'd highlight one thing that you said, which is particularly important, which is that, yes, food security is almost obvious, but it's worth saying, I think, that it is a particular challenge for developing countries, and in particular, the challenge of undernutrition, hunger, is really a developing country issue, even though there are other aspects of malnutrition which are important in other parts of the world. There are lots of things that you've said which I could come back to, but I really want to use the remaining time for other speakers to come back and to comment and also pick up on some of the other things. So what I'd like to do is invite in the remaining 20 minutes our speakers to offer some very short reflections, additional reflections on what they've heard from colleagues. I'd be particularly interested in your thoughts on how WTO rules or the WTO architecture or the international architecture on trade could better support the food security of both producers and consumers, and in particular of the most vulnerable. So let's go round one more time with the different speakers in the order that we've heard them from. Valeria, and of course, please do feel free to pick up on anything you've heard from the other panelists and reflect upon them further in your remarks. And I'd be grateful if you could keep your remarks fairly brief and concise so that we can finish on time and not get into trouble with Facundo. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I guess that when you talked about consumers, producers, I think that under WTO and every time that we talked about a global solution, I like to more think it about in countries. So for me, the discussion will be between net food exporters versus net food importers. And I think that what we need to make sure is that these two groups of countries can collaborate and coordinate and talk. So I find it in two different steps, I guess. One, it could be the short term, that we can really work on transparency. I think that if we can just communicate better the way we're doing our policies and when these things are going to start doing, like export restrictions, for example, we will avoid some of these volatility and these uncertainties that it creates some sort of policies, and also what then net food importers do to try to coordinate, like to compensate the impact that they get. And then in the long term or medium term, I think that we should make sure that we work on a plan or an agenda that it can get these two groups to get something from it. So for example, today I've only listened about export restrictions and how bad these countries that impose them and how they should eliminate them because it's not fair. It's true, totally true. I'm not saying that it should be allowed, but we have to give them something in exchange, because for them it's also to give up something, but they are not getting, for example, better market access to other for their products, or like to try to compensate somehow so that everybody will be interested in collaborating and participating in the discussion. So for this, it could be always also not losing the objective that we always talked about, which is environmental sustainability and healthy diets. So maybe we can think a little bit out of the box, like everybody says, and start thinking, for example, in environmental standards, labeling, or other things that relate to this dilemma of these two groups, of how we can make them sit down at the table and coordinate and discuss something in a productive way. Thank you. I will keep it short. We can maybe go back to this. Thanks.
Thank you, Valeria. And that's actually really fantastic, because you've also picked up on something which I think is really important. Where might there be options for different WTO members or groups of members to actually find ways forward by compromising with one another or exploring trade-offs which could actually meet different concerns that different groups have, without wanting to comment on the specifics of what you've just proposed or suggested. I think it would be great if other panelists could do the same as in their own remarks. Annelies, please, why don't you pick up on what Valeria said and share any thoughts that you may have? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. So yeah, I think I would like to go back to one of the questions that was also listed in the agenda, namely, what's the role of the WTO to support food security of producers and consumers through collaborations with other international organizations? And already in my presentation, I mentioned WTO and OECD collaborate closely on reporting on policies for the Amos market monitor. And in addition, at the OECD, we also collaborate with the WTO on many other initiatives where at the OECD, we provide evidence-based research that could support the discussions at the WTO. And some of the examples are our work on the development of the trade facilitation indicators, also examining digital opportunities in agri-food trade, such as electronic certification or remote audits. And again, this is aimed at both facilitating trade for producers, but also consumers are affected through the food security angle or food safety angle through this, and also collaborations on other SPS measures. But of course, it's not only collaborations with the OECD, but also with other international organizations such as IFPRI, of course, and FAO and others. And again, here, a good example is Amos, because for this initiative, there are 10 international organizations that work together, and they each bring their comparative advantage to the table in order to work towards the goal of the Amos initiative, which aims to increase food market transparency and coordinate policy responses for food security. And I think, yeah, these collaborations between the different international organizations, so this kind of covering another aspect than what was covered before, looking at governments, but looking more at the international organizations. And I think this collaboration is really crucial because first of all, they increase transparency in markets, right? And I already kind of illustrated why this is super important, and this is advantageous for both producers and consumers. Also, these collaborations can inform discussions at the WTO, how to interpret the data, how to interpret, different policies. Having these type of collaborations really helps that. And finally, also by collaborating together, we can really ensure that our work on monitoring, reporting, and evaluating different policies is complementary, that we're not duplicating efforts and that we're really coming out with a clear message. Yes, thanks.
Thank you, Annelies, and thank you also for keeping your remarks so short and focused. That's great. Sophia, can I turn to you now again with the same question about the specific ways in which we can bear in mind the particular food security needs of producers and consumers, in particular the most vulnerable ones, as we think about the future in this area? Thanks.
So maybe a bit like Valeria, but in a different way to reframe it. I think one of the things to acknowledge is that countries rich and poor are facing some common problems with farming. That there's a lot of rural poverty. The highest incidence of poverty in the United States are in rural counties that grow the food, well, it's not often food, but grow ag commodities, don't eat well. And I think you have a generalized problem actually, in a lot of different countries with very different economic structures face this. Rural poverty, rural exclusion from larger economic development, significant levels of poverty. And there's a kind of failure of agricultural economics there that all states are dealing with. And in rich countries, that has a lot of political echo because of the way we structure parliaments. And in some other countries, it has political echo because it's still half or more of the population that lives there. But whatever happens, it's political. And I do think that this is one of the ways in which we are, alongside transparency, there needs to be more recognition of the fact that not only are the WTO members dealing with trade and their obligations to the WTO, but they are the duty holders in the human rights treaties. They are the signatories to the multilateral environmental agreements. They're all having to come up with adaptation strategies. They're also having to come up with mitigation strategies in climate change. And so there's a complexity to all of that goes to the direction Annelies was saying in terms of how international institutions can help governments manage that multifold challenge. And I think that there could be more honesty at the WTO, that every one of those members with very different levels of power is not only trying to deal with its commercial agricultural activity, but it's also trying to deal with some complicated politics and some food security obligations. that don't easily insert themselves. And so we've kind of turned a blind eye on consumption, which means 60 to $80 billion a year in the United States is spent trying to deal with inadequate incomes, supporting, providing food to people. And at the same time, we provide something like, I don't know, 20 billion to the farm sector in very distorting ways. But those are both affecting price, and they're both actually reinforcing existing structures of oligopoly. And it's a long-winded way to say it, but I do think that if there was more room for the politics, actually back to Ranja's point about who's in the room, who is fit to make a trade policy, we need to be more expansive of that, I think, in order also for countries to meet their obligations. Why didn't wealthy countries reform their agriculture as they promised? Partly because they leapt over the domestic objections, pushed through an agreement that they then had no support for. There's probably less support today than there was 25 years ago for the sorts of reforms that would move us off subsidies going to a handful of crops that are overproduced and not particularly useful. So that was another long-winded, large-scale response. But I do think that acknowledgement of the politics of this being larger than the commercial agenda that the formal rules have set out would help.
Thank you, Sophia. Okay, and Ranja, maybe you could also pick up on what you've heard from the other speakers and also reflect on this question, how the trade rules could better address the food security needs of producers and consumers, and especially the most vulnerable ones, building on what you've heard from other people and the discussion so far. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. And I think there were some questions also. I'll try to quickly address at least some of those. So yeah, for me, coming from where I am, I don't see, so the solution for producers and consumers, I see it as a joint thing, because for us it's not possible to import food. You can get subsidized cheap food, say, from developed countries and feed consumers, right? But that is not a long-term solution, because I think simultaneously it has to solve problems of livelihood and stability of supplies. And as I said, this whole food sovereignty debate, that countries should be able to decide what they want to consume, and especially like large populations, what food actually suits them. And there are these movements on slow food and local food and recognizing food sovereignty. So I think all of those kind of fall in line together, that you need to support both production, farmers, and as well as consumers. And in a way, some of these policy tools like stockholding, it has, of course, its problems, but at the same time, it does act as a domestic tool for, domestically for stabilizing some of these. When there's overproduction and prices would fall, and then the government would pay a slightly higher price to cover cost, and that would raise prices for the producers. And then if you have also high prices for consumers, that's again subsidized. So there are tools so what I would say is developing countries do need, in a way, the policy tools and the flexibility to design these solutions their way. And this is reflected through the sustainable development goals, that countries should have the policy space to determine what is their industrial policy, their agricultural policy. So to a certain extent, that policy flexibility has to be given. Now, quickly, I think there were some questions as to why would countries put up export restrictions, because of course they want to, if they want better access for their products. Export restrictions, even under WTO agreements, nobody is supposed to put up perennial export restrictions, right? And I am not at all supporting export restrictions, but we do have to recognize that it has to be balanced, like any disciplines on export restrictions have to be balanced with domestic food security needs. And, no country would want to stop exports, frankly. And they are, even under GATT 11, Article 11 and the Article 12 of AOA recognizes that they will do it only short term, and there are tests for it. Like, it should be essential, it should be temporary, and it should meet like a food security needs. So there are these criteria, and only then they are supposed to. But I think Article 12 and the Article 11 of GATT do provide in a way this balance between like not having any export restrictions, or not limiting exports at all, and balancing your food security. Because I know some of the NFIDCs and LDCs are actually also worried about it, because does it mean that everybody now has to open up exports? And so, for example, a country NFIDC which is buying food at very high prices to meet domestic food security needs, then that gets exported out. And during the pandemic, we have seen that actually developed countries used it for masks and vaccines. If you have unlimited exports, then it could actually be bought up, for example, like, the United States bought up the masks, like mask supply, even which was meant to go to France. So, I mean, it is a complex debate. And of course, the moment a country puts up export restriction, it will hurt other countries. But we do need to find a solution that kind of is balanced. And I mean, I think, anyway, I said too much, so I will not take up more time. I think, yeah, I mean, I think there's a question about governments forcing farmers. I think that also you have to understand it's only under a situation of crisis. I mean, India, for example, had these permanent levies before, when there was a situation of perennial food crisis, and it would have certain levy from farmers that they had to sell to the government. But now it does not have such provisions. Farmers are free to sell. And I think, so, I mean, I think it is in a way like also a response to crisis. And unless we do find long-term solutions to these crisis issues and, avoiding these short-term fixes, I think countries will not need to impose export restrictions or do permanent levies and so on, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ranja, and thanks to all our panelists. I think we've had an incredibly rich debate. We've got a few minutes left, so if I may, I'd like to just take a couple of moments to wrap up on some of the things we've heard. I can't possibly touch on everything because we've had a very, very wide-ranging discussion. But, I would say that the debate we've had is testimony to the importance of this issue on the global agenda. And also, I think it's a moment to acknowledge and recognize the valuable work that is being done in so many organizations, which is informing the discussions amongst policymakers, in governments, in different international fora, and that's extremely, extremely useful. So, as I said, food security is high on the profile for the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO. There are 3 draft texts which have been circulated, which are looking at various aspects of this challenge, the WFP export restrictions decision, which has been mentioned already in our discussion today, the draft declaration on trade and food security. There's also, so those are responding to the short-term immediate challenges around the food security crisis, but also the decision looking at the draft decision looking at the agriculture reform program going forward. And I can tell already from the discussion that there are lots of different aspects of these different drafts, which our different panelists would feel unhappy with, or like to pick holes in, or would no doubt like to improve. And that's very much a reflection of the negotiated nature of those texts. The fact is, different WTO members all have their own areas where they feel improvements could be made. But I think that the real message is we need to carry on having these discussions and carrying on talking about these issues. Agriculture and food security are too important to be left by the wayside. So this is really a plea to keep on having these rich discussions, and to thank the co-sponsors of this event today for having organized that. Thanks to all the panelists, but also all the participants who are with us on the call today. Thank you for your time, and we hope you continue participating in this and other events on this topic. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.